December 1944. The war was supposed to be over. In London, the newspapers were printing victory headlines. In Paris, soldiers were drinking champagne. In Washington, generals were already planning the victory parade. They believed the Nazi war machine was broken, out of fuel, and incapable of fighting back. They were wrong. While the entire world celebrated, one man sat alone in a dark room in France, staring at a map that whispered a terrifying secret. He saw what the generals ignored. He saw the trap. He saw 250,000 German soldiers hiding in the forest, waiting to slaughter the American army. And he knew that if he didn't convince his commander to turn around, the war wouldn't end by Christmas. It would end in a massacre. This is the story of the deadliest silence in World War II. General George S. Patton was the loudest man on the Western Front. He was the god of armored warfare, a man who carried ivory-handled revolvers and believed he was a reincarnated warrior from ancient Rome. He moved fast, struck hard, and never looked back. To the public, he was the hero who liberated France. But in the winter of 1944, Patton wasn't the one who saved the Third Army. That honor belonged to a man nobody knew, a man who wore thick glasses, spoke in a whisper, and spent his days buried under stacks of paper. Colonel Oscar Koch. Koch was Patton's brain. He was the chief of intelligence. And while Patton was looking for glory, Koch was looking for ghosts. The Allied front line stretched for hundreds of miles, but there was one sector everyone ignored: the Ardennes. It was a ghost sector, a dense, frozen forest of pine trees and narrow roads. The American commanders called it a nursery. They sent tired units there to rest. They sent green units there to learn the ropes. It was quiet. It was safe. It was the last place on Earth anyone expected a tank attack. But Oscar Koch didn't believe in safe places. Every morning he stood in front of his massive situational map in Nancy, France. He used grease pencils to mark the location of every known German division. He tracked them like a hunter tracking a wounded animal. But in late October, the tracks stopped. The 6th Panzer Army vanished. The 5th Panzer Army vanished. These weren't just random units, these were Hitler's executioners. The SS armored divisions, the Tigers, the Panthers, the veterans of the Eastern Front. One day they were fighting in the north, and the next day, they were gone. Radio traffic from the German side went dead. The skies over the German border were empty. At Supreme Headquarters, the top Allied generals smiled. They said the Germans were retreating. They said the enemy was licking its wounds, pulling back into the fatherland to survive the winter. They saw the silence as weakness. Koch saw the silence as a weapon. He knew that armies don't just evaporate. If the most dangerous tank divisions in the world weren't on the map, it meant they were hiding. And if they were hiding, they were preparing to kill. Koch started digging. He ignored the optimistic reports coming from London. He focused on the tiny, boring details that everyone else threw in the trash. He looked at the reconnaissance photos of the German rail lines. They showed heavy freight trains moving west, toward the front, under the cover of darkness. Why would a retreating army send supplies forward? He looked at the reports from the intricate network of spies. They mentioned that German towns near the Ardennes were being evacuated. Civilians were being moved out. Why? To clear the roads for something big. He looked at the weather forecast. A massive storm front was moving in from the Atlantic. It brought heavy snow and thick fog. It was the kind of weather that grounded airplanes. And without air support, the American Sherman tanks were sitting ducks for the German Tigers. Koch put the puzzle together. It wasn't a retreat. It was an assembly. The Germans were using the ghost sector against them. They were gathering an armada of steel in the one place the Americans weren't looking. They were waiting for the fog to blind the Allied Air Force. And they were planning to strike exactly when the Americans were most relaxed. It was a masterstroke of deception, and Oscar Koch was the only man in Europe who saw it coming. But seeing the danger is only half the battle. The harder part is getting someone to believe you. In early December, the atmosphere at Allied headquarters was arrogant. The pursuit mentality had taken over. Everyone was obsessed with racing to the Rhine River. When Koch tried to raise the alarm, he was met with laughter. Other intelligence officers called him a pessimist. They pointed to the fuel shortages in Germany. They pointed to the destroyed factories. They said, "The Germans can't attack, it's mathematically impossible." Koch didn't argue, he didn't shout. He just kept updating his map. He drew a big red question mark over the Ardennes. He labeled it enemy concentration. He was the boy who cried wolf, but the wolf was real, and it was breathing down their necks. By December 9th, the signs were undeniable. Koch realized he was running out of time. The storm was coming. If the Third Army kept pushing east, they would expose their flank. They would be cut off. He had to make a move. He had to confront Patton. Walking into Patton's office was not for the faint of heart. The general was known to scream at subordinates, to humiliate officers who brought him bad news. He wanted to attack, not defend. Telling Patton to stop his advance was like telling a shark to stop swimming. Koch walked in. He laid his map on the desk. The room was quiet. He didn't use dramatic words. He simply pointed to the empty spaces. He showed the rail movements. He showed the radio silence. He explained the weather. "General," Koch said softly, "the capability is there. They are going to hit us here." He pointed to the Ardennes. Patton stared at the map. The room held its breath. The staff officers waited for the explosion. They waited for Patton to throw Koch out of the room for being a coward. But Patton didn't scream. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray sky. He knew Koch. He knew that this quiet man didn't guess. If Koch said the Germans were there, they were there. Patton turned around. "It's the perfect setup," he muttered. "They want to cut us in half." In that moment, Patton did something that separates great commanders from average ones. He killed his ego. He abandoned his plan to attack east. He looked at Koch and asked, "What do we need to do?" Koch had the answer ready. "We need to prepare a counterstrike. We need to be ready to turn the army 90 degrees north, to hit them in the flank when they come out of the woods." It sounds simple on paper. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Turning an army of 250,000 men, thousands of tanks, and tons of supplies in the middle of winter is impossible. It requires new maps, new fuel depots, new communication lines. It's like trying to turn a speeding freight train on a dime. Patton didn't hesitate. "Do it," he said. "Start the planning. Don't tell Eisenhower yet. He won't believe us. Just get it ready." For the next 7 days, the Third Army lived a double life. To the outside world, they were still preparing to invade Germany. But behind closed doors, Koch and the staff were working 20-hour days. They were drafting a secret playbook. They were identifying which roads could hold the weight of tanks in the snow. They were stockpiling gasoline. They were creating a ghost army within the real army, ready to pivot north at a specific code word. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the north, the trap was ready to snap shut. The American soldiers in the Ardennes were oblivious. These were the men of the 106th Golden Lions and the 28th Infantry. Many were teenagers, fresh from boot camp. They sat in their foxholes, freezing, complaining about the lack of winter boots. They wrote letters home about the Christmas presents they hoped to receive. They couldn't hear the engines revving up just a few miles away. They couldn't see the white camouflage cloaks of the German stormtroopers moving through the trees. They didn't know that 1,600 artillery guns were aimed directly at their heads. The silence in the forest was heavy. It was the deep breath before the scream. On the night of December 15th, Oscar Koch sat in his office. The reports had stopped coming in completely. The map was finished. The math was done. There was nothing left to analyze. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He was exhausted. He had done everything he could. He had warned the one man who would listen. Now, all he could do was wait. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The world ended. The horizon exploded. The sky turned orange. The roar of the German artillery was so loud it could be heard in Paris. Thousands of shells rained down on the sleeping American boys in their foxholes. The trees shattered. The earth shook. And then came the tanks. Out of the mist, the German panzers rolled forward. They were unstoppable. They crushed the thin American line in minutes. Confusion reigned. Phone lines were cut. Command posts were overrun. Panic spread like a virus up the chain of command. Generals were waking up to reports of massive breakthroughs. "Where did they come from?" they screamed. "Who are they?" The German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. By midday, the situation was catastrophic. The Germans were punching a massive hole in the Allied line. They were driving for the coast. If they succeeded, they would split the British and American armies. They would capture the port of Antwerp. They could force a negotiated peace. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. The mood in the room was grim. The generals were pale. They were looking at maps that showed red arrows swarming over their positions. Eisenhower looked at his commanders. "I need someone to attack the southern flank of this bulge," he said. "I need someone to stop them." He looked at Patton. "George, how long will it take you to turn your army around and attack?" The other generals did the math in their heads. To disengage from a battle, turn around, drive 100 miles through a blizzard, and launch a new attack? It would take at least 4 days, maybe a week. Patton didn't look at his notes. He didn't look at his staff. He looked Eisenhower in the eye. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, Patton said. The room went silent. Some of the British officers laughed. They thought he was boasting. They thought he was insane. "You cannot move an army that fast. It breaks the laws of physics." "Don't be a fool, George," someone said. But Patton wasn't being a fool. He wasn't guessing. He lit a cigar and smiled. "I have the plans already written," Patton said. "My staff has been working on them for a week. The code name is Gabriel. I just need to make a phone call." The other generals were stunned. They didn't know about the secret meetings. They didn't know about the ghost maps. They didn't know about Oscar Koch. While the rest of the Allied command was paralyzed by shock, Patton walked to the telephone. He called his headquarters. He spoke 3 words. "Play ball, Gabriel!" And just like that, the miracle began. In the middle of the worst winter in Europe's history, the Third Army performed the impossible. 133,000 tanks and trucks pulled out of the line. They turned 90 degrees. They drove north into the teeth of the blizzard. The roads were sheets of ice. The wind was cutting through the soldiers' coats like knives. But they moved. They moved day and night. The Germans, who were celebrating their breakthrough, looked at their flanks and saw nothing but empty snow. They thought they were safe. They thought Patton was stuck in the south. They had no idea that a freight train of steel was barreling towards them. By December 22nd, Patton's tanks smashed into the German flank. The element of surprise was total. The hunters became the hunted. The German advance stalled. The pressure on the trapped American units began to lift. and at the center of the storm was the town of Bastogne. Inside the town, the 101st Airborne paratroopers were surrounded. They were out of food. They were running out of ammunition. They were freezing. The German commander had demanded their surrender. The American commander had replied with one word: nuts. They were holding on by their fingernails. They were praying for a miracle. And on the morning of December 26th, they saw it. Through the trees, a Sherman tank broke through the German lines. Then another. Then another. It was Patton's 4th Armored Division. The siege was broken. The bulge was deflated. The German gamble had failed. It was one of the greatest military feats in history, a maneuver that is still studied in war colleges today. The speed, the precision, the audacity. But when the history books were written, the cameras focused on Patton. They focused on his speeches. They focused on the tanks. Nobody took a picture of the quiet man in the back of the room. Nobody interviewed Colonel Oscar Koch. He simply went back to his desk. He took down the map with the red question mark. He filed away the reports on the 6th Panzer Army. He cleaned his glasses. And he started working on the next day's intelligence. He didn't need the glory. He knew what he had done. He knew that thousands of men were going home to their wives and children because he had refused to look away from the darkness. But the story doesn't end with the victory. Because sometimes being right is dangerous, and sometimes the man who saves the army is the one the army wants to forget. After the war, a strange thing happened. You would think Oscar Koch would be celebrated. You would think he would be promoted to the highest levels of the Pentagon. Instead, he was pushed aside. Why? Because institutions hate being told they were wrong. Koch's existence was a reminder of the massive failure of the Allied High Command. Every time they looked at him, they were reminded that they had walked into a trap. They were reminded that they had been arrogant. So, while Patton became a legend, Koch became a footnote. But in the years that followed, the soldiers who fought in the bulge began to learn the truth. They learned that their survival wasn't just luck. It wasn't just Patton's guts. It was Koch's brain. And this brings us to the most important question of all. Not about war, but about life. We all have a Patton in our lives. The loud voice, the confident leader, the one who wants to charge ahead, and we love them for it. But who is your Koch? Who is the person in your life who sits in the corner and tells you the truth you don't want to hear? The person who points out the red flags. The person who whispers a warning when everyone else is cheering. It's easy to listen to the people who tell us we are winning. It's easy to listen to the people who say everything is going to be fine. It takes courage to listen to the ghost. Oscar Koch died in 1970. He never sought fame, but his legacy is written in the blood of the men he saved. He proved that in a world of noise, the most powerful weapon is silence, and that sometimes the only thing standing between victory and disaster is one man looking at a map and refusing to lie. So the next time you see a statue of a general or a CEO or a leader standing tall, look at the shadows behind them. That's where the real work is done. That's where the ghosts live. And if you listen closely, you might just hear them whispering the truth. The calendar on the wall said December 16th, 1944. It was 5:30 in the morning. The forest of the Ardennes was pitch black and silent. The American soldiers in their foxholes were sleeping. They were dreaming of home, of Christmas turkeys and warm fires. And then, the world ended. It didn't start with a single shot. It started with the apocalypse. 1,600 German artillery guns opened fire at the exact same second. The horizon turned into a solid wall of orange fire. The ground shook with such violence that men were thrown out of their sleeping bags. Trees that had stood for 100 years were snapped like matchsticks. The air turned into a blender of jagged steel and splintered wood. This was not a probe. This was the hammer of God coming down on the 106th Infantry Division. For the young Americans on the front line, there was no time to be brave. There was only time to scream. The telephone lines were cut in the first minute. Command bunkers were buried under tons of earth. And then, out of the smoke and the mist, came the monsters. Tiger tanks, King Tigers, 60-ton beasts of steel that were immune to American bazookas. They rolled out of the fog like prehistoric creatures, crushing jeeps and men beneath their tracks. Behind them came the white-clad SS stormtroopers, moving like ghosts in the snow, firing their machine guns from the hip. Chaos, absolute, total chaos. The American line didn't just bend, it evaporated. Units were surrounded before they even knew they were under attack. Men were fighting with shovels and empty rifles. By midday, thousands of American soldiers were surrendering. It was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the war against Germany. Reports started flooding into the Allied headquarters in Paris, but they made no sense. Panic spread like a virus up the chain of command. A radio operator screamed into his microphone that heavy tanks were in the Ardennes. The commanders in the rear shouted back that it was impossible. They yelled that there were no tanks in the Ardennes. The operator cried back that they were there, and they were killing everyone. In the span of 6 hours, the Germans punched a hole 45 miles wide in the Allied front. They were pouring through the gap like water through a burst dam, heading straight for the Meuse River. If they crossed that river, they would split the British and American armies in two. They would capture the giant supply port of Antwerp. They would starve the Allies of fuel. The war would be lost. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, stared at the map. His face was pale. The red arrows were growing longer by the hour. His intelligence officers were stunned. They stuttered and made excuses about the weather and the radio silence. But hundreds of miles away, in the headquarters of the Third Army, there was no panic. There was no screaming. There was only the quiet scratching of a match lighting a cigar. Colonel Oscar Koch walked into General Patton's office. He didn't run. He didn't look terrified. He looked vindicated. He handed Patton the latest report and said calmly that it was happening exactly where they said it would. Patton didn't look surprised. He looked at the map, at the ghost army that was finally revealing itself. He growled that the bastards had stuck their head in the meat grinder. And he had the handle. But having the handle and turning it were two different things. Eisenhower called an emergency summit of all the top commanders at Verdun on December 19th. The atmosphere in the room was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Everyone was there. General Bradley, Field Marshal Montgomery. The air was freezing because the heating had failed. The generals stood around a pot-bellied stove, rubbing their hands, looking at the disaster unfolding on the map. Eisenhower looked at his commanders. He needed a miracle. He needed someone to stop the German tidal wave. But everyone in the room knew the physics of war. You cannot stop a blitzkrieg in motion. You cannot turn an army around in the snow. Eisenhower turned to Patton. He asked him heavily how long it would take to turn his army around and attack the southern flank of the Bulge. The other generals did the math in their heads. Patton's army was currently fighting in the Saar region, 100 miles south. To attack the Bulge, he would have to disengage from a fight, turn 130,000 vehicles around on icy roads, drive through a blizzard, and launch a coordinated attack against fresh panzer divisions. It would take a week, maybe 10 days. By then, the Germans would be in Antwerp. Patton stood up. He looked at Eisenhower. He didn't blink. He shouted loudly that he could attack on the morning of December 22nd. The room went dead silent. A British officer let out a short, dry laugh. He muttered that Patton shouldn't be a fool. He said that was 48 hours away, and it was a logistical impossibility to move a corps that fast. Patton snapped back arrogantly that he wasn't being a fool. He told them his staff had been working on this for days. He said he had 3 divisions ready to roll, and the code name was Gabriel. He just needed to make the call. The other generals stared at him. They looked at him like he was a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. They didn't understand. They thought Patton was guessing. They didn't know that Oscar Koch had already mapped every road. They didn't know the fuel trucks were already idling. They didn't know the orders were already typed, sitting in a safe, waiting for this exact moment. Eisenhower looked at Patton. He saw the fire in his eyes. He said quietly to start the ball rolling. Patton walked out of the room. He found a telephone. He dialed his headquarters. He shouted the code words, "Play ball, Gabriel." And then, the impossible happened. The Third Army didn't just turn, it spun. Imagine a snake coiling back to strike. In the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in 30 years, the roads of France became a river of steel. It was a nightmare of logistics. Tanks slid on the ice and crashed into ravines. Trucks broke down and were pushed into ditches to keep the column moving. Men froze in the back of open carriers, their uniforms stiff with ice. But they didn't stop. Patton was everywhere. He stood at the crossroads in his open jeep, freezing wind whipping his face. He screamed at the drivers to move. He yelled that there were men dying up there and they didn't dare stop. He knew that speed was the only thing that mattered. Every hour they wasted was another hour the Germans had to fortify their positions. But while Patton was racing north, the Germans were closing the trap on the town of Bastogne. Bastogne was a small market town where 7 roads met. It was the heart of the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire battle. And right now, it was surrounded. Inside the town were the men of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, paratroopers. They were tough, but they were in a desperate situation. They were completely cut off from the outside world. They had no winter clothes. They were fighting in summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. They were digging foxholes in frozen ground that was as hard as granite. They had no medical supplies because their field hospital had been captured on the first day. Inside the dark cellars of the town, the wounded men were screaming. The only thing the doctors could give them was a sip of cognac to dull the pain. They used torn bed sheets to wrap shattered legs. They ran out of bandages. They ran out of morphine. Surrounding them were 4 German divisions, 4 against 1. The German commander, General von Luttwitz, sent a message under a white flag. It was a long, formal letter demanding an immediate surrender to save the Americans from total annihilation. The American commander was General Anthony McAuliffe. He read the letter. He looked at his dirty, freezing staff officers. He laughed and said they had to be kidding. He typed out his official reply to the German army. It wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't polite. It was one word typed in the center of the page. Nuts! The German officers were confused. They asked the American messenger what the word meant. The soldier smiled and told them it meant they could go to hell. The Germans were furious. They unleashed everything they had on Bastogne. They bombed it from the air. They shelled it with heavy artillery. They sent wave after wave of tanks against the perimeter. But the paratroopers didn't break. They held the line. They fought with frozen fingers. They fought with stolen weapons. When they ran out of ammo, they fought with knives and shovels. They held on because they knew one thing. Patton was coming. But Patton had a problem even he couldn't scream at. The weather. The fog was so thick you couldn't see the hood of your Jeep. The snow was knee-deep. And the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force everyone said was dead, was back. German planes swooped down on the columns, strafing the trucks and bombing the American positions. Patton needed clear skies. He needed his air support. But the forecast was terrible. Snow, snow, and more snow. So Patton did something that became legend. He called his chaplain, Father O'Neill. He told the chaplain he wanted a prayer for good weather. The chaplain looked confused and asked if he wanted a prayer to kill Germans. Patton barked that he wanted a prayer for sunshine, because he was on good terms with the Lord and he needed help. They printed the prayer on small cards and gave one to every soldier in the Third Army. 250,000 men, shivering in the snow, reciting a prayer for sunlight. It sounded crazy. It sounded desperate. But the next morning, on December 23rd, the miracle happened. The snow stopped. The clouds broke. The sun came out. It was a cold, hard, brilliant sun. The American pilots scrambled to their planes, yelling that the old man had done it. Thunderbolts and Mustangs roared into the air, raining hell on the German tanks. The sky turned black with smoke as the German armor burned. The Third Army surged forward. They were now crashing into the southern flank of the German Bulge. The fighting was brutal. It was close-quarters combat in the snow, bayonets and grenades. But the Americans had the momentum. They could see the smoke rising from Bastogne in the distance. They knew their brothers were dying inside that town. On Christmas Day, the fighting reached its peak. The Germans launched one final, desperate attack to crush Bastogne. They sent flamethrower tanks to burn the paratroopers out of their holes. The snow turned red with blood. But the line held. And on the afternoon of December 26th, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a Sherman tank named Cobra King, crested a hill south of the town. He had been fighting for 3 days straight without sleep. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. He looked through his periscope. In the distance, about 1,000 yards away, he saw a line of foxholes in the snow. And inside those foxholes, he saw green helmets. He didn't know if they were Germans or Americans. He ordered his gunner to aim the cannon. He moved the tank forward slowly. He shouted to his crew to keep their eyes open and blast them if they fired. The tank rolled closer. 50 yards, 40 yards. Suddenly, a figure stood up in one of the foxholes. It was an American soldier. He didn't raise a rifle. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring at the white star painted on the side of the tank. Lieutenant Boggess opened the hatch. He climbed out. He walked through the snow toward the paratrooper. The paratrooper was shaking. He had tears freezing on his cheeks. He reached out a dirty hand. Boggess took it. He smiled and said he bet the lieutenant was glad to see them. The siege was broken. The road was open. Ambulances raced into the town to save the wounded. Ammo trucks raced in to reload the guns. When the news reached headquarters, Patton didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded. He knew that the impossible had been done. He had turned an army in the middle of a blizzard and defeated the best soldiers Germany had left. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the German gamble had failed. They had lost their tanks. They had lost their fuel. And they had lost their last chance to win the war. It was one of the greatest military feats in history, a maneuver that is still studied in war colleges today. The speed, the precision, the audacity. But as the smoke cleared and the cameras arrived to film the victory, they focused on Patton. They focused on his speeches. They focused on the tanks. Nobody took a picture of the quiet man in the back of the room. Nobody interviewed Colonel Oscar Koch. He simply went back to his desk in Nancy. The room was quiet again. The maps were still on the wall. Most men would have been out drinking champagne. Most men would have been bragging to the newspapers that they predicted the attack and saved the army. But Oscar Koch wasn't most men. He picked up his grease pencil. He looked at the map. And he started marking the next threat. He knew that the war wasn't over. He knew that thousands more would die before they reached Berlin. And he knew that his job wasn't to be a hero. His job was to see the things that nobody else wanted to see. Because the lesson of the Battle of the Bulge isn't just about firepower. It isn't just about tanks or air support. It is about the courage to listen. Patton was a great general, but he would have been a dead general if he had ignored the quiet voice in the corner. He would have been the general who lost the war. Instead, he became the general who saved it, not because he was the smartest man in the room, but because he was smart enough to trust the man who was. Thousands of men came home from the Ardennes because of that trust. They grew old, they had families, they lived their lives. All because one man looked at a stack of boring reports and refused to look away from the truth. This brings us to the end of the battle, but not the end of the story. Because the tragedy of Oscar Koch wasn't the war. The tragedy was what happened after. When the peace treaties were signed and the parades were held, the world wanted heroes who looked like movie stars. They wanted loud men with ivory pistols. They didn't want a quiet man with thick glasses who solved problems with math. So history did what history always does. It remembered the noise, and it forgot the signal. By January 1945, the guns in the Ardennes finally fell silent. The snow began to melt, and as the white blanket washed away, it revealed the terrible cost of the arrogance that had ignored Oscar Koch's warnings. 19,000 Americans lay dead, 47,000 were wounded, 23,000 were missing or captured. It was the costliest battle in the history of the United States Army. The Germans fared even worse. They left 100,000 men and almost all of their tanks rusting in the mud. The gamble had failed. The road to Berlin was open. But as the Allied armies raced into Germany to end the Third Reich, the partnership that had saved the war began to dissolve. General Patton continued his drive across the Rhine. He was unstoppable. He captured thousands of towns. He liberated concentration camps. He rode on the back of his tank like a conquering king. The press couldn't get enough of him. He was the face of victory. Oscar Koch, as always, remained in the shadows. He stayed in the briefing rooms. He kept counting the enemy units. He kept predicting the German moves. But the danger had passed. The desperate need for a man who could see the future was gone. And then, the war ended. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The guns stopped firing across Europe. The soldiers went home. Parades were thrown in New York and London. Confetti rained down on the heads of the generals. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. George Patton, the man who had survived gunshot wounds in World War I, the man who had walked through artillery fire without flinching, the man who believed he was immortal, did not die on the battlefield. In December 1945, just months after the victory, Patton was involved in a minor car accident in Germany. His staff car collided with a truck at low speed. Everyone else in the car was fine, but Patton broke his neck. He lay in a hospital bed for 12 days, paralyzed. The man of action was trapped in a broken body. He whispered to his wife, "This is a hell of a way to die." And then, he was gone. The lion was dead. The legend was cemented forever. He was buried in Luxembourg, at the head of his troops who died in the Battle of the Bulge. Even in death, he was leading his men. But what about the Ghost? Oscar Koch survived the war. He returned to the United States. But there were no parades for him. There were no movies made about his life. There were no statues erected in his hometown. He was a quiet professional in a world that loved loud heroes. He retired from the army and moved to a small house. He lived a simple life. He watched as the history books were written, and he watched as his name was left out of them. Historians wrote about the intelligence failure of the Battle of the Bulge. They wrote that the Allies were completely surprised. They wrote that nobody saw it coming. Koch read these books. He knew they were wrong. He knew that he had seen it coming. He knew that the files existed. He knew that the warnings had been given. But he didn't scream. He didn't go to the newspapers and demand a correction. He didn't fight for his legacy. He simply sat down, pulled out his typewriter, and wrote his own account. He called it G2, Intelligence for Patton. It wasn't a bestseller. It was a dry, technical book. It was filled with maps and reports. It was a textbook for intelligence officers, not a thriller for the public. In the book, he didn't brag. He simply laid out the facts. He showed how the clues were there. He showed how the patterns were clear. And he showed how one general had the courage to listen. Koch died in 1970. He passed away quietly, just as he had lived. And for a long time, that seemed to be the end of the story. Patton was the hero. Koch was the footnote. But truth has a way of surviving. Decades later, military historians began to dig deeper into the archives. They opened the old files from the Third Army. They looked at the daily briefing notes from November 1944, and they were shocked. They found Koch's warnings. They found the maps with the big red question marks over the Ardennes. They found the predictions that were accurate down to the day and the mile. They realized that the Battle of the Bulge wasn't an intelligence failure. It was a listening failure. The intelligence was perfect. The system worked. The only thing that broke was the human element at the top. The arrogance of the commanders who refused to believe the data because it didn't fit their happy narrative. Today, inside the U.S. Army Intelligence Hall of Fame, there is a place for Oscar Koch. He is studied by young officers as the gold standard of what an intelligence officer should be. He is the patron saint of the truth-tellers. But his story is about more than just military tactics. It is a mirror for all of us. We live in a noisy world. We are surrounded by people who are shouting. Politicians, influencers, bosses. Everyone is trying to be the loudest person in the room. Everyone wants to be Patton. We reward confidence. We reward charisma. We follow the people who say, "I know the way," without hesitation. But often, the people who really know the way are the ones whispering. Think about your own life. Think about your business, your family, your relationships. Who is the Oscar Koch in your circle? Maybe it is the quiet employee who sends you an email saying, "I think there is a problem with these numbers," and you ignore it because business is good. Maybe it is your wife or your husband sitting you down and saying, "I think we are drifting apart," and you brush it off because you are busy. Maybe it is a friend who pulls you aside and says, "I think you are drinking too much," and you laugh it off because you are having fun. We all have a ghost in our lives. Someone who sees the train wreck coming before we do. Someone who loves us enough to tell us the uncomfortable truth. The tragedy of the Battle of the Bulge wasn't that the Germans attacked. That is what enemies do. The tragedy was that thousands of men died because the leaders were deaf to the warning. Don't let that be your tragedy. When the quiet voice speaks, stop. Turn down the noise. Put away your ego and listen. Because the loud people will tell you what you want to hear. They will tell you that you are winning. They will tell you that the war is over and you will be home by Christmas. But the quiet people, the ghosts, they will tell you what you need to hear. They will tell you where the tigers are hiding, and they might just save your life. This channel is dedicated to finding those ghosts. We are dedicated to digging up the stories that history tried to bury. We believe that the missing pages are the most important ones. If you believe that the truth matters, no matter how quiet it is, then join us. Click that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, help us tell the stories of the men and women who stood in the shadows and changed the world. There are thousands of files left to open. There are thousands of voices waiting to be heard. My name is James, and this has been WWAR II Missing Pages. I'll see you in the next briefing.